Hi, Alexia Lewis RD with New Motivation Coaching. We just finished sharing some information over on our Facebook page, New Motivation Coaching, and as we wrap up our posts on salt, I wanted to put them all together for you with a couple of short videos. Enjoy. First up, we addressed a great question we get from our clients a lot, which is, does sea salt have less sodium than table salt? This is such a confusing topic, and I'll share with you why that is. One reason is there are nutritional differences between the two types of salt, and that has to do with how they're processed. So sea salt, of course, comes from the sea, and the way it's processed is mostly through evaporation. So they basically take all the water away, and what's left is sea salt. And so it also has some minerals from being in the sea, and those minerals are typically potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and some other trace minerals. So there is a little bit different nutrition in sea salt. Table salt, this is a really old container of table salt. Table salt, however, is processed mostly from salt mines. And so it's stripped of minerals during its processing, but typically it comes with added iodine. And the reason is that back in the 1920s, we had a pretty bad goiter problem in the States, and this is how the powers that be decided to get iodine into our diet to help address the goiter issues. So to get the iodine in iodized table salt, they have to add potassium iodide. So you're going to see a few different things on the nutrition label in terms of the ingredients. Table salt is salt, calcium silicate, which is added to prevent clumping, much like you see grains of rice in a salt shaker at a restaurant. And potassium iodide is just the vehicle to get the iodine in iodized salt. So if your salt is not iodized, you probably won't see that on the label. By contrast, this Mediterranean sea salt, the only ingredient is Mediterranean sea salt. So it's a much more natural product in terms of not needing to have additives to prevent longer life on the shelf, to prevent clumping, and to add the iodine. So the big question, right? We talked about the minerals. Salt doesn't have any calories. We don't have to worry about that. Salt, the question is always sodium. Which one has less? Does sea salt have less sodium than table salt? And the answer is yes and no. Don't you hate that? Okay, let me help you figure it out. Here's why. By weight, these two are just about the same. If you weigh them out, they're going to have the same amount of sodium. However, by volume, which is what we do in practice when we grab a pinch of salt or a teaspoon of salt, that's volume. And by volume, sea salt does have less sodium than table salt. And the reason is the crystal size. So as you know, table salt is very fine. And so when you get a spoon or a pinch, those little crystals of salt line up against each other very neatly, and there's not a lot of air between the crystals. So by volume, you're getting a little more salt because they nest together. Whereas sea salt and kosher salt and other bigger flakes of salt, because of the shape of the crystals, they don't line up next to each other as neatly, and you have some pockets of air in between the crystals. So that those pockets of air take up space where there's not salt, so therefore there's less sodium. Let me give you some numbers. So a teaspoon of table salt has 2,325 milligrams of sodium. A teaspoon of sea salt has between 1,200 and 2,360 milligrams. In this case, this one has 2,000 milligrams in a teaspoon. So it's right up next to the 2,360 in table salt. And kosher salt has somewhere between 2,000 and 2,360 milligrams of sodium as well. So it really all depends on how those little salt crystals line up to see if there's a difference in sodium content. So hopefully this makes a little more sense to you now. Big question, which one do you choose? Well, salt's a flavor enhancer, which means it makes food more delicious. So we absolutely should use salt in our cooking because delicious food can be healthy, and we want healthy, delicious food. So pick the salt you like best, number one. Number two, if you're doing baking, baking is really just a really yummy form of chemistry, so we've got to be precise. So use whatever the recipe calls for. In other cooking, home chefs and professional chefs tend to like the bigger crystals, so they would go more with a sea salt or a kosher salt. But if you need a salt to dissolve in something, you're probably better off with the smaller crystals in table salt. When it comes down to nutrition, there is just not much difference between any of the different types of salts. And there are no magical health, healing properties in organic or sea salts. They're just more expensive, and they have different flavors because of the different trace minerals and other types of fancy things they add to the more expensive salts. So choose whichever one you prefer that best fits into your budget. So thank you for watching. Please post a comment to let me know what you think about salt and your health, and if you were inspired to find your numbers and make some changes or not.